Shortly before Christmas, South Africa received a formal invitation from the elite club of emerging market economies known as BRIC. It's a coalition that includes Brazil, Russia, India and China, hence BRIC. They reportedly asked South Africa to join as a full member of the bloc. Joining us now to talk to us about this is George Glynos. Thanks very much for coming through. Jim O'Neill, who's the chairman of Goldman Sachs, is not very convinced that South Africa qualifies to be a member of the BRIC member states. What do you think informed the decision to invite South Africa? And in fact, can you also clarify for us whether South Africa was invited to come to the heads of state meeting in April or has been invited to join the BRIC member states?
As far as I understand it, at this stage, it's still fairly informal. I think the group themselves, and I think we need to just distinguish a couple of things here. The BRIC countries, as such, as you mentioned, is a coalition. It's not a formal group as such. So, membership, I think, is perhaps a fairly strong word. But in any case, they have been invited to conduct discussions with the rest of them, specifically by China, which is not surprising because China is the power bloc or the power country out of the four. But you know, I think it's. Whatever happens between the BRIC countries and South Africa, it's always there. It's always about what each party can gain out of this deal. They wouldn't be going into something if there wasn't something South Africa could offer them. So, you know, in terms of Jim O'Neill's comments, I think you also need to look at those in context. I think it was in about August last year, I read an article where he was talking about Africa perhaps being the next BRIC country to join that coalition. And to the extent that Africa is very much has got a lot of characteristics of some of those BRIC countries, it makes some sense. But you need a structure, you need a backbone, and I think South Africa offers that.
Well, in terms of what people stand to gain for the BRIC nations, South Africa is seen as a gateway into the rest of Africa, as you're suggesting, and it's also got very strong democratic ideals. So just in terms of improving on the discourse around governance, South Africa has a part to play, but should there be more to it than that?
Again, you know, we need to look at South Africa more as a strategic partner than as a country that offers scale. So, as you pointed out, South Africa is nowhere near the same size as a China, Brazil, Russia, India, at all in any sort of way. But Africa is. But Africa, unfortunately for Africa, doesn't have the kind of developed markets that are required in order to facilitate effective trade between the continent and those BRIC countries. So you need to have some sort of a foothold. And I don't think it's any coincidence, for example, that you've seen China express a huge amount of interest in not only South African banks, but in South African mining operations. India's come in a fairly big way as well. And again, I think it's a strategic play on the part of the BRIC when looking at South Africa as opposed to looking at it from a scale perspective at all. The scale comes through in the African continent.
I think people do want to see some tangible gains in terms of this relationship, and trade is one of those. And certainly, as you're suggesting, China's become the largest trading partner to most African nations. India also becoming more forthright in its involvement with Africa. But when you look at trade figures, for instance, although Africa's trade has improved by 30% with emerging market economies, Africa's contribution to global trade is still less than 2%, even within that emerging market space. So how can we leverage the new kind of relationship?
Well, and right there is the opportunity, because it's a relatively untapped mineral resource. We know that the Chinese are looking at Africa in almost a form of economic colonialization, if you like. As a colleague of mine pointed out to me earlier today, it's almost as if China is looking to vendor finance some of their sales into Africa because it's such an untapped market. So there's tremendous opportunity there, and China have recognized that, but they haven't just recognized that it's an untapped potential consumer market, it's an untapped market whereby they could secure a tremendous amount of resources. And so that is strategically important for the likes of China and India to grow.
They talk about the next 11 emerging market economies to watch, and on it are countries like South Korea, Indonesia, Turkey, Mexico, even Nigeria. And interestingly, South Africa doesn't feature in terms of the next 11 emerging market economies to watch. So if South Africa can barely compete with these middle range economies, how's it going to be competitive at the BRIC level?
You see, now it's not necessarily an issue about being competitive as it is offering that structural backbone that's required to conduct efficient trade. So you look at a lot of those countries that you've mentioned, there's still very much a scale aspect to those. A country like Mexico, for example, is a substantial market, as would Turkey be in that Middle East region. So a lot of them are very strategically placed and are important in that respect and have scale to offer. South Africa is somewhat different in that regard. If you have a look, for example, at the amount of portfolio flows from foreigners into Africa, you'd probably find a good 80 to 90% of that is into South Africa alone. You'd also find that South Africa's banking industry, for example, is probably amongst the most progressive in the world, let alone emerging markets, and there's a lot that can be offered there, aside from, of course, the technical scale and ability that a lot of the miners tend to offer. So there's a lot that can be drawn on from South Africa, and it's not about the scale. It's about what South Africa can offer the BRIC in terms of promoting that expansion that specifically the likes of China and India are looking for.
But certainly we do need to talk about competitive advantages and mutual beneficiation and a variety of elements. The Indians have come through on the ICT front. We've seen many deals, Bharti Airtel being the latest. We're seeing involvement in extractive industries, particularly in the part of the Chinese, the Indians moving in the coal space, the Brazilians coming into mining, also coming heavily into agriculture and biofuels. Where can Africa tap into that for their own beneficiation, for the development of their own industries, and also to boost their export potential?
Sure. Well, the most obvious one would have to come down to minerals at the end of the day. We know that Africa as a continent is a huge untapped mineral resource, and of course China have recognized that. So if you have a look at the relationships that currently exist, the relationship between, let's say, China and India and the likes of Russia is there specifically to extract the energy resources that Russia have to offer. Africa would be looked at in a slightly different way, and it would be looked at in terms of its mineral deposits. Now, they are untapped, and so there's a lot of potential there. Again, speaking to that economic colonialization that I was talking about, China into Africa, securing those resources, and in doing so also helping the continent develop. So I think the strategic resource, the strategic element there is always, it comes back down to the mineral resources, which are at some point in time going to run out in the normal places of extraction.
And a final question to you, George. I mean, the reason why we have the BRICS is that, or the BRIC, is that there's anticipation that within the next 20 or 30 years, they will constitute the largest economies in the world, surpassing and eclipsing Europe and the United States. And already they account for something like 60% of the rate of global growth. Right. Do you think that this can be sustained, given the fact that America, although rebounding, still constitutes the largest economy in the world, and we still need those American consumers? Or are we going to see great strides to develop indigenous consumers in some of these BRIC economies? Are people earning enough money in these economies for these to be the new custodians of the global architecture?
Well, Lerato, that's in essence where the strategies for the BRIC lie, is in uplifting the middle class of their own countries. And as we know, we're talking about substantial populations here, well in excess of a few billion, if you combine them together. So therein lies the opportunity, and that's what the BRIC needs to focus on. And of course, if I can bring that back to South Africa, if there's something encouraging about all of this, is that South Africa is exposing itself to the big growth players in the global arena, and I think there's only benefits naturally to be had from that. Of course, we have a lot of work to do in terms of our own economy, but in terms of international trade, I think South Africa is probably going down the right path, and I think, again, just to reiterate the point, that there's something to gain on both sides.